Hey, what's going on, everyone? We've got another episode of Mosher's Mailbag, and a lot of questions, and I would say a lot of concern from my Patreon subscribers this week after the Eagles not only lose to Dallas, but then have a loss that's basically overshadowed by injury to Carson Wentz, some former players coming speaking out against the past medical staff ways. Obviously, Nick Foles now will be starting the slim wild card options that are still available. But obviously, the Carson Wentz injury is taking center stage, and I know a lot of people have questions about that, along with Doug Peterson and some other things. So I'm going to get right into it, and we'll start with our first question. The first question asks, what should or will happen with Doug Peterson, well, with this offense in particular, I guess going into the offseason, and should Doug Peterson continue to call plays? So let's start with what's going to happen to the offense going into the offseason. Are there going to be changes? You never can tell. I think it depends a lot on how the Eagles finish over the next 3 games. I think if they can go 2-1, maybe make the wild card, then there may not be changes. But I'm inclined to think that you might see some changes in the offensive coaching staff. And that's not from any tip off that I've received. But I do know that the history of the Eagles is that when there is a certain level of underachieving, and you can certainly argue that there has been underachieving on offense this year, that somebody has to go. There's always a fall guy. A couple of years ago, it was Greg Lewis. Who knows who it'll be going into this offseason. But I do have a feeling. I will say this: it will not surprise me if there are changes. Now, will Doug be the guy? No, I don't think Doug will be the one who gets changed or fired or anything like that. Should he call plays next year? Yeah, I think he should start off calling plays next year. If things don't go well again, he may want to look into giving that up. But I think Doug has actually been a very good play caller, play designer. You can argue about certain games, certain elements of the game, circumstance, situation where maybe he has come up short this year, certainly as opposed to last year. But in general, I still think that there are plays that were left out on the field that didn't have anything to do with Doug, as far as whether it was bad blocking or Carson Wentz just not seeing it or wide receiver not running a great route. So I think Doug will be the play caller again next year, to at least to start, and we'll see what happens with that. Second question is refers to a story I wrote earlier in the week where, and this I do put on Doug, where I noted that Golden Tate only played 20 snaps against the Cowboys the second time around. He didn't play a lot of snaps the first time around, and people had a problem with that. And Doug tried to use the excuse of first game for Golden Tate, hurry up offense that he wasn't familiar with. But here it is, the most important game of the year in Dallas, and Golden Tate again not playing a lot of snaps. And the problem was, and at least the way Doug tried to describe it, they did play a lot of 12 personnel, which is 2 wide receivers, 2 tight ends. And when they went 2 wide, a lot of times you had Alshon Jeffrey as one, and you either had Golden Tate or Nelson Aguilar or the other. And I guess Doug feels that you can't penalize Nelson Aguilar. He's actually on pace for the same amount of yards last year. It doesn't seem like it, but he has not played poorly. And so why is he going to take Nelson Aguilar out on the field just to put Golden Tate in when they both primarily play the same position and they're both productive receivers? And that's where I would stop and say, you know what, I think Doug needed to, at some point, tell Nelson, you know what, we gave up a 3rd-round pick for Golden Tate. He's a very accomplished wide receiver in this league. Even when I go to 12 personnel and I only have 2 wide receivers out there, I need to go with Golden Tate. That's our guy, at least for the rest of the year, and we'll figure out what happens next year. We'll figure out a way around it next year. But he had to tell Nelson that, Nelson, you're going to take a reduced role for the betterment of the team. He did it last year with LeGarrette Blount. They acquired Jay Ajayi, and they basically said, LeGarrette, don't complain. You got to figure it out. That's probably something that should have been done with Nelson Aguilar. Now, the fact that it wasn't means to me that Doug is very loyal to Nelson Aguilar and at the expense of Golden Tate. And now if you're Howie Roseman and you just gave up a 3rd-round pick to get Golden Tate, wouldn't you have the expectation that your head coach is going to play this guy? And again, I have to think that this trade was made with consultation from Doug. I don't think Howie made the trade and said, oh, Doug, by the way, we're getting Golden Tate. I'm sure there had to be a powwow between GM, coach, Joe Douglas, everybody involved. So why they were willing to give up a third round pick for Golden Tate, and why Doug Peterson won't play Golden Tate more, to me, is mind boggling. And I think that's just an indictment of some of the coaching decisions that Doug has made this year. Fireable offense. They just gave the guy a contract extension. He won the team a Super Bowl in his second year of coaching. I don't think it's a fireable offense. I think it's an egregious mistake. And I think it's something that's got to be addressed in the offseason between Doug, Howie, Golden Tate, if they plan on retaining him, Nelson, everybody involved. I do think it's Doug's fault, but I don't think it's a fireable offense. Next question, and there's going to be a lot of questions about this, and it asks about Carson Wentz getting a second opinion on his back injury. Does that reflect a lack of trust with medical staff? So there's been a lot of negativity, negative press around the medical staff. You've seen a lot of former players come out and say things on Twitter about the Eagles medical staff. So I think in this case, though, while there are, in my homework, I think that there's some legit concern about certain staff members and the way the staff was put together. But to keep it in a Carson Wentz perspective right now, no, I don't think his wanting a second opinion reflects distrust of the medical staff. I think it's pretty common for guys to have a second opinion, especially on something as complex as a back injury. I know when the CBA came out, there was a lot of language in that about second opinions and that players should be encouraged and embraced if they ask to get second opinions. Most people I've spoken to over the past week say that teams are more than willing and more than happy to let players seek outside counsel on an injury. And so I don't think that Carson going to seek a second opinion means that he has lost faith or confidence in the Eagles' ability to diagnose it. As far as I know, is stress fractures and stress injuries. They don't often appear on an MRI. They appear on CT scans. And the information that you've seen come out is that Carson was first given MRIs when the back started bothering him. And it was only recently that he had a CT scan that showed that he had fractures. And so some of that is completely normal. And so how will this affect the relationship between Carson Wentz and the Eagles going forward? I don't think much. I think the Eagles will make every attempt to re-sign Carson Wentz in this offseason. This is just my speculation based on what they've done in the past with quarterbacks, going back to Donovan McNabb, to Michael Vick when he came here and took over for Kevin Kolb and had success. They usually scramble to make sure that the quarterback is locked up for a long time. It's to their advantage, I think, to give Carson Wentz the extension now as opposed to waiting, because the price tag for a franchise quarterback is only going to raise year after year after year. And so I think when the season's over, as long as Carson's healthy and the back is fine and they say it doesn't need surgery, I think that they're going to give Carson Wentz a major, major contract extension. And Carson Wentz, I think, is going to sign it because it's a lot of money and not play around and let any kind of issue that people may think he has with the medical staff stand in the way of that. That's how I see it. So I don't think it's going to be a big factor. But we do have another question that parlays into the medical staff, and the question is, will there be any consequences from the league or from the NFLPA regarding the Eagles with what you've heard about their handling of injuries this year? And should an investigation be launched? So I spent a lot of time this week talking with, I would say, some NFL people in and around the NovaCare complex, or people who know what goes on at the NovaCare complex, some of them being NFL executives, some of them being sports medicine experts, a good mix just to get an idea of what's going on. And the biggest thing I was able to take away is that obviously Howie Roseman decided that he was going to clean house of the medical staff, the doctors and the trainers, many of them who were here for the Super Bowl win, and restart with new people. Why did Howie Roseman feel the need to do that coming off the Super Bowl? I can't tell you that. Howie really hasn't come out and explained it. I have my theories, and I do know that as a reporter, there was some information over the last few years that was coming out and being leaked to certain people in the local media. And I know just from past experience that Howie tries to run a tight ship and doesn't like certain stuff being leaked to certain people in the local media. Now, there's some hypocrisy involved in that, because when you see Adam Schefter or Chris Mortensen come out with a report, or you see the real Ian Rappaport, when you see real high-level reporters coming out with information that's usually medical, I think it's safe to say it comes from the Eagles and it comes from high-up people, Howie, Jeffrey, things of that nature. So when local reporters get information, though, that didn't come from Howie or didn't come from Jeffrey, I think it makes them upset. And so you saw a whole cleaning of the house of the medical staff. And they brought in a new trainer. They brought in a rehab specialist. They promoted some doctors. So they have some different orthopedists and everything. And this is a roundabout way of me saying that the information I got was from people who I looked into and say, well, look at the experience of the people that they brought in. The head trainer that they brought in was with the Titans previously. He wasn't their top trainer. He was like second or third in line, and he was only there for a couple of years. They brought in a rehab specialist, and that's a very important role, I guess, because rehab is, for injured players, that's a Monday through Saturday job. They brought in a rehab specialist who has a lot of qualifications for being a rehab specialist, except for the fact that she has never worked for an NFL team before. She's worked with NFL players. She's worked with, but never with NFL teams and, on the day-to-day basis. And so you have to wonder, you go from this organization that for a long time had guys like Rick Burkholder down to Chris Peduzzi, and then, guys like DeLuca and Dorsheimer, who were their team doctors in the past, and they had a lot of experience. And, Rick Burkholder has his own tree, his own trainer tree. And so now you look at it and you say, well, there seems to be a whole lot of, personnel that isn't as experienced as the Eagles are used to. And to me, that signals that there's potentially an issue there. And I think you've seen it this year. The Eagles have too many players on IR. And not only that, they have a lot of players like Darren Sproles, for example, Mac Hollins, another example, Jay Ajayi, who either were diagnosed late or were given. You heard one diagnosis, and then the next thing you know, they're out for a whole lot longer than you ever felt. It's too fishy. Something's going on there. And I think that, and one thing that I was told was that the players right now don't have a great relationship. They don't have a great relationship of trust with what they're hearing from the medical staff and what they're seeing. And that can be problematic. I wouldn't be surprised if Howie felt like he had to kind of go back and take a look at the entire staff, trainers, medical staff, and see if he made the right decision there. As far as will there be consequences from the league or from the NFLPA, those are usually things that you find out later. Every team I've ever, been involved with has had disgruntled players. So you're seeing a lot of guys go to social media, guys who used to play on the team, and air some grievances. And I have to separate that from what's going on now, because I think every team has guys who have always been disgruntled with injuries. So I don't want to tie that in to what's going on right now with the current players and the current medical staff. But I'll say, look out and see, there's always, every team always seems to have grievances and filed by players and everything. We'll see. We'll see what happens if you see further action taken by players against the Eagles. But I don't know if an investigation needs to be launched, but I do think that the Eagles front office, Howie, Don Zwolenski, Jeffrey Lurie, I think they need to really look into the moves that were made last offseason with the personnel that they brought into the medical staff and trainer staff, and, double check and see if they made the right decisions on that. All right, that's going to do it for this episode of Mosher's Mailbag. Thank you all. As always, I appreciate the subscriptions. I really appreciate everybody who asks questions. Appreciate the readers. Make sure you check out the Inside the Birds podcast that I do with Adam Kaplan and Billy Osborne, radio.com. And you can find it on the homepage of 94.1 WIP. And, of course, we'll be doing this again next week. So we'll see what happens with this Eagles-Rams game. All right, everybody, have a great weekend.